The young samurai walks through the market with his sword at his side. A merchant spits near his feet. Not on them, near them. Close enough to be deliberate, far enough to be deniable. The young samurai stops, turns, and in the fraction of a second it takes him to decide what to do next. He has already lost. Here is the truth that almost no one will tell you plainly. Every time you react to disrespect, you confirm it. Not just to them, to yourself. Because the reaction is a message. It is a signal, broadcast in every direction, including inward, that what they said or did actually reached you, that the insult had somewhere to land, that the lever they pulled connected to a mechanism that responds to their pull. And a man whose mechanism responds to other men's pulls is not free. He is operated. Miyamoto Musashi understood this so completely that he built an entire philosophy around it. He wrote, "Do not be intent on winning the small fights." Most people read this as strategic advice. It is not strategic advice, it is a diagnosis. The small fights are the ones disrespect creates. The sharp word, the sideways glance, the merchant who spits near your feet, the man in the crowded room who says something designed to see you flinch. These are not fights worth winning, because the moment you enter them, you have already proven something the man who provoked you wanted to prove. That you can be moved, that the architecture of your composure has gaps wide enough for an insult to enter, that you are, at your core, available to whoever decides to reach for you. The man who does not react to disrespect is not a man who feels nothing. He is a man who has understood completely, in the bone, past the level of performance, that the reaction is the only currency the insult has, and that he is under no obligation to pay. This is not weakness disguised as strength. This is strength so settled that weakness cannot reach it. The young samurai who always won and always lost his name was Ryunosuke. He was 19 years old, the son of a minor samurai family, and he had been raised on a single principle drilled into him by every teacher, every uncle, every elder voice he had ever trusted. Honor is what you defend. If a man disrespects you, answer. If a man questions your name, correct him. If a man tests your worth, prove it. The logic was complete, airtight. The kind of logic that only reveals its flaw when it has been lived long enough to produce its actual fruit. And by 19, Ryunosuke had fought 7 duels. He had won all 7. He was also, though he would not have used these words, exhausted, isolated, and quietly consumed by a rage that had no visible source and no reliable exit. He was respected. He was not at peace, and he had begun to notice, in the half-awareness that precedes real recognition, that the respect he had earned through 7 duels had not produced the one thing he had expected it to produce: freedom from the 8th. The 8th was always coming, because the world contains an infinite supply of men willing to test a young samurai who has proven that testing him produces a response. He had become, without intending to, without knowing it, a product that men consumed: his honor, his reactions, his willingness to answer every provocation with steel. He was a machine other men operated for their own purposes, and he was very, very tired. The moment the machinery finally broke was not a duel. It was smaller than that. He was walking through a provincial market on an ordinary afternoon. A merchant, heavyset, older, with the particular confidence of a man whose wealth protects him from most consequences, stepped into his path. Not aggressively, just enough. Enough to require Ryunosuke to move around him. Ryunosuke stopped. The merchant looked at him, did not apologize, did not step aside, simply looked, with the flat, appraising gaze of a man evaluating a dog's willingness to bite. And Ryunosuke felt it. The familiar heat, the gathering of something in his chest that he had 7 times before let out through his sword. His hand moved toward the hilt before his mind gave permission. He caught himself, stopped, not from wisdom, not from strategic calculation, from a sudden, uninvited, completely disorienting thought that had never before entered his mind in one of these moments. This man wants me to do this. It was the first time he had seen it, really seen it. The merchant was not a threat, was not an opponent, was not a peer challenging his honor in any way that required his honor to respond. The merchant was a man who had discovered, somehow, through whatever accumulated experience of provoking young samurai, that stepping into a certain kind of young man's path in a certain kind of way produced a certain kind of reaction. And the reaction was the point. Not the dispute, not the outcome, the reaction. Because the reaction gave the merchant something he wanted. Entertainment, validation, the small, dark satisfaction of watching a sharper, faster, more dangerous man be operated by the simplest of levers. And Ryunosuke had, 7 times before, given it to him, or men like him, freely, reliably, with the confident belief that he was defending his honor. He had not been defending his honor. He had been performing for men whose entire purpose was to make him perform. He stood there for a long moment. The merchant was still looking at him, waiting. The look had begun to shift, the appraisal beginning to include the first hint of something like disappointment. Ryunosuke understood it. The merchant was disappointed, because Ryunosuke was not performing, and the performance was what the merchant had come for. Ryunosuke stepped around him, like slowly, without hurrying, without the stiff precision of a man performing indifference, which is its own form of performance, visible as performance to anyone watching. Just stepped around, the way you step around a puddle, with the same quality of attention, which is to say, almost none. He walked away. The merchant said something behind him, sharper now, pointed. Ryunosuke did not turn. He kept walking, and somewhere in the next 100 steps, with the heat still rising in his chest, with the old reflex still telling him that he had just dishonored himself, with every voice of every teacher and uncle and elder screaming that he had failed some fundamental test. He understood something he had never understood before. The heat is not honor. The heat is the mechanism the merchant was trying to operate. And walking away with the heat still present, unexpressed, unacted upon, was not cowardice. It was the first time in his life he had not been operated. He went to his teacher that evening, an old man named Horin, who had taught him the sword from the age of 11 and had watched all 7 duels with an expression Ryunosuke had never been able to read. Ryunosuke told him what had happened. He told it honestly, including the part where he had nearly drawn, the part where he had caught himself, the part where he had walked away with the heat still burning and had not turned around even when the merchant pressed. He expected disappointment. He received something he did not expect. Horin looked at him for a long time. Then, with the quietest smile Ryunosuke had ever seen on him, "Sit down." He poured tea. He set the cup in front of Ryunosuke and said, "Tonight, for the first time, I can actually begin to teach you." Ryunosuke stared at him. "I have been your student for 8 years." "Yes," said Horin, "8 years of sword technique. Tonight I begin teaching you what the sword is actually for." He sat back, and what it is not for. What Horin showed him over the months that followed, and the specific reason that every previous teacher had told Ryunosuke the exact opposite of what was true. That is where this story turns. Because what Ryunosuke had been taught about honor was not wrong. It was incomplete. And the missing piece, the part every elder in his life had failed to pass on, was the difference between a man who defends his honor and a man who has made his honor indefensible. Those are not the same man, and they do not live in the same world. The indefensible honor. Horin did not begin with a technique. He began with a question. What is honor? Ryunosuke opened his mouth. The answer was there, taught to him so many times it arrived as reflex. The reputation a man defends through his actions. Horin nodded slowly. So honor lives outside the man. Yes, in the opinions of others. Yes, and you have been taught to defend this thing that lives outside you, in the minds of other people, with your sword. Silence. Do you see the problem? Ryunosuke saw it. The way you see something that has been in front of you for years, visible only when someone finally points. If honor lives in the opinions of others, every man with an opinion has access to it. Every merchant, every stranger, every fool with a voice. They can all reach it, test it, require the sword to answer. And a man who must draw his sword every time someone's opinion threatens his honor is not a samurai. He is employed, unpaid, by every man who decides to provoke him. So, what is the alternative? Ryunosuke asked. Move honor inside you, said Horin. where no one else can reach it. How? By understanding what honor actually is, not what you were taught. He set down the cup. The honor a man actually possesses is the alignment between who he is and how he acts. When those two things match, he has honor. When they diverge, he has lost it. No external opinion can grant it or take it. He leaned forward slightly. The merchant could not touch your honor, not because he was beneath you. Because honor is not something external men can touch. They can touch my reputation. Yes, reputation opens doors. Reputation affects how the world treats you. Reputation is worth some care. He paused. But reputation is not worth your sword, and it is certainly not worth your peace. This is the first myth that must break. The myth that a strong man defends his reputation with force. This is not strength. This is dependence wearing strength's clothes, because the man who defends his reputation with force is bound to it, required to protect it, respond to every threat against it. He does not own his reputation. His reputation owns him. Musashi wrote, in plain words, that the true warrior does not fight small opponents, not because he is above the fight, because entering the fight would cost him something worth more than the insult was worth. Focus, clarity, the interior stillness that lets a man see what is actually in front of him. A man in agitation cannot think clearly. A man who cannot think clearly cannot act correctly. And a man who cannot act correctly, regardless of skill, will eventually meet someone who can, and will lose. Horin gave Ryunosuke a practice. Every day someone will provoke you, in small ways. I want you to name them, silently, without responding. Name them how? See the provocation, see the heat rising, see the automatic reaction assembling itself before it deploys. Name what it is. A provocation? Yes, and name what it wants. The reaction. Every reaction is currency. Every provocation is a transaction request. You do not owe the payment. He set down his tea. You are permitted to decline. The first week was strange. Ryunosuke had not realized how many provocations his day contained. The servant who spoke with a shade too little respect. The fellow student's small jest. The passing comment that would have produced, a week ago, a sharp look, a stiff shoulder, a small hardening of the jaw. Now he named them. Provocation, reaction requested, payment declined, silently, continuously, and something began to shift. By the end of the second week, the day felt lighter, less populated by sharp edges, not because the world had softened, because he had stopped catching on every edge. He told Horin, I am quieter, not inside, outside, the world is quieter around me. Because I am not producing the disturbances. Horin nodded. Most men believe disturbances happen to them. They do not. Most disturbances are produced in the collision between the provocation and the reaction. Remove the reaction, and most of what you thought was happening to you simply does not happen anymore. He paused. It was never happening to you. It was happening through you. If you feel this, if you have spent years believing the sharpness of your life is imposed from outside, this is why. Part of what reaches you is real, but a large portion of what you have been responding to was only ever completed by your response. Remove the reaction, not all reactions, but the automatic ones, the ones extracted without your consent, and a surprising amount of what you thought was your life simply disappears, not because it was illusory, because it required two participants. And you have quietly withdrawn as the second. 2 months in, Ryunosuke faced something harder. Another samurai. A man his age, from a rival family, with an older history of bad blood between the houses. They met at a formal gathering. The man, Kuroda, made a comment about Ryunosuke's family. Sharp, precise, aimed with the accuracy of a line prepared in advance. Several older men heard it. The room shifted in the way rooms shift when everyone is waiting to see what happens next. The old Ryunosuke would have answered immediately. The new Ryunosuke stood there, named it. Provocation, reaction requested, payment declined. He looked at Kuroda, nodded, not agreeing, not dismissing, simply acknowledging that he had heard, and turned to the older man beside him. Resumed the conversation Kuroda had interrupted. The room held its breath. Then, gradually, continued. Kuroda stood there, His line had landed in empty space. The reaction he had come for had not arrived. Without the reaction, his line was simply a line. Spoken, heard, unanswered. It hung in the air for a moment, then dissipated. Kuroda left the gathering early. Ryunosuke did not think about him again that evening. Not from discipline, because there was nothing to think about. The provocation had not become anything, had not become a dispute, a confrontation, a grudge that would require management. It had simply not landed. And what does not land does not require a response. But Horin had not yet told Ryunosuke something that only arrived after the second month, when the practice had become reliable enough for the next layer to surface. "You have learned not to be operated," Horin said one evening. "That is the first gate. There is another. There is always another." He looked at his student. "What you have built is a kind of invulnerability. No one can move you. This is real. This is valuable." He paused. "It is also a trap. A trap. Because the man who cannot be moved can also become the man who does not move. And those are not the same thing." He set down his tea. That distinction is where the true test begins. What he meant by the difference between a man who cannot be moved and a man who does not move. That is where this story turns toward its deepest ground. Because the trap of invulnerability has destroyed more men than any provocation ever has. And Ryunosuke was walking directly into it, without knowing it. Yet, the trap of the unmoved man. The trap arrived slowly. So slowly that Ryunosuke did not notice it for months. 6 months in, he was, by every external measure, transformed. Provocations slid off him. Insults found no purchase. Men who had once reached him with a single sentence discovered that whatever they were reaching for was no longer where it used to be. He noticed it first with a younger student at the dojo. The boy was struggling, publicly, humiliated by an older student who was exploiting the younger one's inexperience with the casual cruelty of a man who knows the rules will protect him. The old Ryunosuke would have intervened immediately. The new Ryunosuke watched, named it provocation, aimed at the boy, not at me. Payment declined, and did nothing. The boy, humiliated, left the dojo in silence. Ryunosuke continued his practice, and something in him, quiet, almost unnoticed, felt wrong. Not the hot wrongness of a man pulled off his center, a colder wrongness. The wrongness of a man who had been present for something that required him and had chosen absence. He told Horin that evening. Horin listened, was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You have reached the trap." The trap. The trap of the unmoved man. He looked at his student with an expression Ryunosuke had not seen before, closer to concern than approval. "The practice I gave you was to stop you from being operated by provocations aimed at you. It was never meant to make you a man who does not respond to the world." He set down his cup. But that is what men reliably do with this practice. They learn not to react. And then, gradually, without noticing, they expand, not reacting into not responding. And those are different, completely different. This is where the path becomes most dangerous. The man who has learned not to be moved has built a real capacity. But that same capacity, taken one step too far, produces something that looks like wisdom from outside and is, from inside, closer to abandonment. Abandonment of the moments that require a response. Abandonment of the people whose lives asked for his presence. The unmoved man. Invulnerable. Also, and slowly, absent from his own life. Horin said it plainly. Fudoshin, the immovable mind, is not the mind that refuses to move. It is the mind that moves only from the right place. He held up one finger. Not moved by provocation, moved by principle, moved by care. I'm moved by what the situation actually requires, not by the agitation the situation has produced in you. So when the boy was humiliated, you had a responsibility. Not to react, to respond. Different words for different things. Reaction is automatic, response is chosen. Yes, a man who refuses to react can still choose to respond. But a man who refuses to respond has mistaken invulnerability for wisdom, and the mistake will cost him more than all his previous reactions combined. This is the second myth that must break. The myth that mastery of emotion means absence of action, that the disciplined man floats through the world unmoved by anything, engaged with nothing. This is not mastery. This is sophisticated withdrawal. And withdrawal, however calm it looks, is not the same as strength. Real depth is not distance, and it is the foundation that allows action to be true when it arrives. How do I know the difference? Ryunosuke asked. You check the source. Where is the impulse to act coming from? If the impulse comes from the heat, the agitation, the wounded self, the lever being pressed, decline it. And if it comes from somewhere else, if it comes from clear seeing, from the recognition that something is genuinely wrong, that your presence is required, that the situation asks not for your anger but for your steady action. He looked at Ryunosuke directly. Then you move, fully, without apology, not because you were provoked, because you were needed. He paused. The difference is everything. Ryunosuke returned to the dojo the next morning earlier than usual. The younger student was there alone, practicing a basic form without supervision, as with the grimness of a boy who had been humiliated and could not let it go. Ryunosuke sat at the edge of the practice floor, watched for a few moments. Then, without drama, your stance is wrong. Show me. I will correct it. He spent an hour with the younger student, teaching patiently, precisely, without reference to the humiliation of the day before. He did not apologize for watching, did not explain why he had not intervened, did not perform the role of the noble defender belatedly arriving. He simply responded with what was needed. At the moment, responding could actually help rather than satisfy some internal need of his own. Horan was watching from across the courtyard. That evening, over tea, he said, "You have found the distinction. It feels different from my first years of always answering. Because I was not doing it for myself, not for my pride, my honor, the story of being the kind of man who defends the weak. I was doing it because the boy needed what I could give. Yes, and that is Fudoshin fully understood. Not the absence of movement, the presence of chosen movement from the clear ground, without agitation, without the contamination of ego." He set down his cup. A man who has this, who can be unmoved by provocation and fully engaged with responsibility, is not weakened by disrespect, cannot be weakened by disrespect, because disrespect no longer reaches him in any way that matters, and his action, when it comes from something disrespect cannot touch. But there was one more thing Ryunosuke would need to face. Not from an enemy, not from a rival, not from any opponent he could meet with either silence or steel. A test from the one source of provocation that had never, in all his years of training, been addressed. The source that lives closest to every man, that cannot be walked away from, that knows every weakness because it has watched every moment. And Ryunosuke was about to meet it. Head on. The voice that cannot be outrun. The final provocation did not come from outside. It came from inside. Ryunosuke was walking home one evening along a familiar road when it arrived. Not as a sudden intrusion, but the way it always arrives in men who have spent their lives running fast enough to stay ahead of it. Quietly, in the space between one thought and the next. A voice. Not literally a voice, the interior kind, and the one that lives inside every man and speaks in the unguarded moments when the day's activity has settled. It said, "You are not what you think you are." He stopped walking, not because the voice had startled him, because it was familiar. It had been there, in various forms, for as long as he could remember. He had always responded the same way he had once responded to external provocations, with heat, with sharp internal defense. Not true. I am disciplined. I am respected. Look at the evidence. He had argued with the voice for years, and the voice, like all provocations that receive the reaction they are fishing for, had never gone away. This time, he did not argue. He stood in the road and listened to what it said next. "You have built an invulnerability. You are mistaking it for character. Removing reactions is not the same as becoming someone." He held the words, let them sit, and found, for the first time, that the voice was not an enemy. It was a messenger, saying something he needed to hear. This is the test no one speaks of clearly. The one that comes after a man has mastered his reactions to the world, because the world is only half the provocation he will face in his life. The other half lives inside him, and that half cannot be walked away from, cannot be silenced, cannot be declined as a transaction request. The interior voice has intimate access. It knows every weakness because it has been watching every moment, and the man who has spent his life reacting to it, arguing, defending, performing confidence over it, has been operated by it just as completely as the young samurai was operated by the merchant. Ryunosuke told Horin what had happened. "You have met the final opponent," said the old man. "I thought the boy's situation was the final test. That was the test of whether you could respond when needed. This is the test of whether you can receive when spoken to." "Receive what?" "The truth, from yourself, without reacting to it." He poured tea. The interior voice, in most men, is not their enemy. It is the only part of them that tells the truth without decoration, which is why most men spend their lives arguing with it. He set down the pot. They treat it like a provocation from outside. They defend, they counter, and all of this produces the same exhaustion that external provocations produce. Because the voice does not go away. Because the voice is trying to help. And help that is rejected for long enough becomes criticism. This reframes the interior voice entirely, not as the enemy of the disciplined man, as the oldest and most truly private teacher any man will ever have. The voice that names the gap between who you are and who you have been presenting yourself to be is not attacking you. It is pointing. Every man has the gap. The question is whether you will do with the voice what you have learned to do with external provocations. Name it, receive it. Decide what to do with what it has shown you, without the automatic defense, without the heat. Ryunosuke sat with the voice's message for weeks. A man who only knows what he does not do has not yet chosen what he does. It was true. He had built a sophisticated capacity for non-reaction. He had not yet built the equivalent capacity for chosen action. He had defined himself by refusal. He had not yet defined himself by commitment. The committed man was the work of the next phase, not a separate practice, an integration. He began, slowly, to identify what he was for. He was for the younger students, not as a reactive defender, as a steady, reliable presence who showed up for them regardless of whether any individual moment called for dramatic intervention. He was for his own training, not as performance, as the daily deepening of the craft he had chosen. He was for the small number of people whose lives were genuinely intertwined with his own. These commitments did not make him reactive again. They made him chosen, and a chosen man, engaged by decision rather than by provocation, cannot be weakened by disrespect. Because disrespect arrives as a request, his energy is already committed elsewhere. Everything else receives no response, not from coldness, from prior commitment, now. Your life, not a feudal Japanese road, not a dojo with a patient old teacher. Your life, which has its own merchants, its own sharp comments, its own crowded rooms where someone says something designed to see you flinch, and, more importantly, its own interior voice, the one that speaks in the unguarded moments, the one you have been arguing with for longer than you can remember. Here is the one thing: the next time you feel disrespected, externally or internally, pause. Not to suppress, not to perform calm, to name, provocation, a request for my reaction, a transaction being proposed. Then ask one question: who am I committed to being, regardless of what just happened? The answer, if it has been chosen in advance, in the honest ground of a man who has done the work, becomes your response. Not the old automaticity of reactions extracted by provocation. The new automaticity of a man whose direction was decided long before the provocation arrived. Ryunosuke lived into old age. He fought one more duel, defended one more student, gave his response, full, chosen, without the old heat, in the moments that asked for it, and refused, silently, to give his response in the 1,000 moments that did not. He was respected. He was also, and this is the thing men rarely achieved, at peace. Not the peace of absence. The peace of a man whose sword lived in its scabbard, because his honor lived somewhere no sword could defend. Inside him, where no one, no merchant, no rival, no voice of any kind, could reach it. The merchant still spits near other men's feet in other markets. He will always spit, because spitting is what men like him do. But the man who walks past without turning, without reacting, without performing indifference, without needing the merchant to know he has been refused, that man is free. Not because the merchant cannot reach him, because the merchant is not, and never was, the point. The point was always the inner ground, the place where the man chose, in advance, who he was going to be. Regardless of what the world did to test that choice, that ground is available to you tonight, if you are willing to stop defending it with your reactions and start building it with your choices. If this reached the voice in you, leave one word below.